The reading today is from the British poet W.H. Auden, his poem September 1st, 1939. That's the day the Nazis invaded Poland, beginning the Second World War. Auden was sitting in a bar in New York City, and he wrote this. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Thinking straight in tough times. All my life, people who remembered the Second World War have said, if only we could get together like during the war. Well, boy howdy, here we are. We've got one. For many of us, national emergencies are a new thing. Many of us remember 9/11, but the emergency was short-lived and immediately diffused into ill-advised wars. Large and long social dislocations have, fortunately, been rare in the United States. It's a function of privilege. It's also a thing of the past. Panic, hoarding, black marketing, agoraphobia, xenophobia. We've got it all going on just now. My wife, Teresa, who works for a school district, called the other day when she got off work late and said, society as we know it is crumbling and it's difficult to pick up the pieces. And I think that just about sums it up. I'm reminded of Rudyard Kipling's poem, If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs. But why is it so hard to keep your head just now? Rev Jim said last week that this sort of crisis is a magnifier. How do we keep our heads when things have gotten so big? Our theme for the month of March is wisdom. And today I want us to think about how to think wisely. We're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. A national emergency has been declared. A state emergency has been declared. There's a lot of emergency and a lot of illness and a lot of stress. There's just a whole lotta right now. What might be a wise response? Catastrophizing isn't wise. Magical thinking isn't wise. Running around screaming, the sky is falling, isn't wise. So, what is? The simple-minded, if you will, picture of how the human mind works divides what's sometimes called the lizard brain or limbic system from the cortex, the part of the brain responsible for cognitive function, our rationality. Lizard brain, rationality. That picture is great for a thumbnail summary, but it's misleading as a way of understanding how we think. And it can lend credence to those quick fixes that are going on out there. The fact is, what our brain does, our consciousness, is a product of a constant interaction between all those parts of our brain. This fact, added to our more recent understanding of what mind is, I talked about that a few weeks ago. Our mind is the product of emotion and perception and our surroundings, our memories floating up, all coming at us at exactly the same time. Our brains are marvelous things, and our minds are incredibly complex, and our consciousness is a marvel too. And all that wonder can tell us to run and hide. All that wonderful stuff can tell us the sky is falling. So, let's ponder a little bit about how we ponder. Now, the way I imagine this is not scientific, I admit, but it works for me. I call it forward, backward, now, and wandering. Now, if that works good for you, good. We usually think forward. What am I doing next? This is our reaction mode. This is how we navigate the world. We use our perceptions and we're ready to react if some danger comes along. We go around anticipating, what next, what next? My father, who had dementia, lost this ability. The last thing I ever did with my father was lay carpet. Now, he knew how to lay carpet. He'd done it many, many times. But this time, he couldn't think of what to do next. There's a corner. We're going to have to trim a little bit of the carpet off. I need a tool. He couldn't think about that. He had lost that ability, and therefore he had lost the ability to care for himself. Thinking forward is our default way of thinking, and it's reactive. We always think forward, 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 except sometimes we think backwards. Now, that's the location of both memory and reason. Now, yeah, it's more complicated than that, but bear with me. Thinking backwards is one of the places where wisdom comes from. A few weeks ago, I told a story about the Norse god Odin, who gave his right eye to drink from the well of wisdom. And what Odin learned from that well of wisdom were the old stories and the old wise sayings. So memory, history, and the deep wisdom of human stories, that's a thinking backwards. There's a technique that's called walking back the cat. It's used to discover how accidents happen. It's used in counterintelligence when analysts look at a decision that a foreign government makes, and then they look at the intelligence that they had before that decision was made, and they can sometimes find where there is disagreements or cracks in the government. It's also part of our scientific method. If an experiment can't be reproduced, it's held in suspicion. A good mechanic uses the same technique. You see what's actually broken, then you trace back how those factors could be involved, and then you begin to eliminate the possibilities of what it can't be, and eventually you find the problem. In the coronavirus outbreak, experts are looking at the history of pandemics. They're looking at models of how infection spreads and looking at the results of quarantines and social distancing. Then we have some idea how the future is going to look. But that's about responding. A third way of thinking is thinking now, in the moment itself, which is about contemplation and meditation and mindfulness. The fact is that actually we always live only in this moment. We do time travel. We remember the past, we predict the future, but actually we're right here, right now, all the time. And remembering that can both calm anxiety and help us realize that we don't have to act out of habit. We can change our responses. Also, mindfulness in the moment can help us observe how our own minds are working. That loud, chattering voice that many of us hear, that's not the center of yourself. You can stop the chatter and you can quiet it down. Then there are those moments that our minds wander. That's where creativity and joy often occur. The struggle is keeping those modes in mind. Yeah, how to think during the current crisis. First, we know how many people have been thinking, toilet paper! There's a shortage! Must buy all I can now! Which is why there's a shortage. Fact is, toilet paper is a domestically produced commodity with a very short supply chain. The average American household uses 100 rolls of toilet paper a year. That's 8.3 rolls per month. The psychology behind toilet paper hoarding appears to be that when people panic, they run to the store. Toilet paper is cheap. People feel like they're doing something, and so they buy a lot, which creates the shortage, which creates hoarding behavior. You can see how the thinking forward mechanism, the react now mechanism, can be triggered and do harm. Business guru Seth Godin claims that we have three modes. The easiest thing, he says, is to react. The second easiest thing is to respond. And the hardest thing to do is initiate. Start something new. So we see how our react works. It causes panic. Yeah, respond. That's the logic part. What's logical given our present pandemic? What do we do in these circumstances? Let me think it out. Firstly, now, this is a major social dislocation, as I mentioned earlier. These sorts of dislocations don't happen very often. The last major social dislocation in the United States was the Second World War. Before that, it was the Great Depression. Before that, it was the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. So, we do have some models to look back on to see how people did things. We know that hoarding behavior and black market behavior come with the territory during major social dislocations. Just look at some of the World War II era posters. And notice that Attorney General Ellison promised to crack down on price gouging behavior. It comes with the territory when you have a major social dislocation. You can read online about the measures that Minneapolis and St. Paul took back in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. Shutting down gatherings of people and limiting access to public transportation were two of the measures. But it was too little and too late, and something on the order of 1,500 people died of the influenza between the fall of 1918 and the spring of 1919. The two cities did not coordinate their efforts at that time. This time the governor has stepped in. We learned something. Good move. Now, I've always been interested in history. When I was a kid, I really wanted one of my grandfathers to have been in the First World War. The fact is, they were both drafted and went to boot camp, where they, contracted the Spanish flu and were ill until the war ended. Now, they were both very happy that they had contracted the flu instead of going to the front lines, since they thought their chances with the flu were better than their chances doing frontal assaults on German machine guns. Now, one of the reasons the flu spread so quickly is that governments were moving large numbers of young people around in 1918, even when they were sick. Also, in 1918, media outlets all over Europe were in propaganda mode. They didn't talk about deaths from disease. That would be demoralizing. It's called the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country in World War I, and so the Spanish media actually reported the flu as it was happening. Here in the U.S., the nation ground to a halt. But out of that experience came serious action and serious medical and scientific study concerning epidemiology. And collectively, we learned lessons that prevented another pandemic for more than a century. And it informs what we're doing today. That's thinking backwards. That's reason. And that's how we respond. So how do we do what Seth Godin calls the hardest thing? Initiate. Now, one way is thinking now, in the moment, and getting into that contemplation and meditation mode. We quiet that voice that says react, react, react. We quiet that voice that says respond, respond, respond. We quiet those imperatives and perceive what's going on right now. We find stillness, and suddenly possibilities arise. new ways of seeing things. We can think outside of that proverbial box. One good question to ask yourself is, what's my problem right now? I often discover, to my eternal amazement, that actually nothing's wrong with me right now. I'm merely worried. I'm time traveling, worrying about the future and the past. I'm merely attempting that time travel, which doesn't help anything or anybody. In the now, we find creativity and we innovate, we initiate. And then there's that last mental state I mentioned, one that can't be forced, the mind wandering. We can set up space for it, but we can't force it. But that's where the aha moments come from. Albert Einstein on a streetcar, after hours and weeks of working on that relativity problem, suddenly, aha, he saw it all in an instant. Why are we so afraid of allowing our minds to wander? How about trying to set up some times to just let your mind wander? It's a choice. React, respond, or initiate. What are you going to do? We live in challenging times. The voices of conspiracies and superstitions have shown themselves for the hucksters that they are. This moment, dedicated and compassionate people all over the globe are joining together in this fight, using their reason and their compassion. Back in 1939, poet W.H. Auden caught such a moment very well. He wrote, "Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play." What would happen if that didn't go on? He wrote, "Lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good." That was the feel of September 1st, 1939. And it's a feeling that many of us have today. But let's embrace, rather than fear, compassion and hope. May we practice a wise fearlessness and an unconditional love. And may we find that compassionate stillness in the chaos so that we can be open to experience. As Auden phrased it, we must love one another or die. Now, as always, it's true. We must love one another or die. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.